a very warm welcome to today's event, today's Meet the World event on the subject of imposter syndrome. And my name is Daniel Hahn, and I'm delighted to be joined by two brilliant, accomplished translators today. I should say we have a couple of apologies. Nadia Abdulatif and Jamie Lee Searle are unable to be with us for today's event, unfortunately, though they've both very kindly sent us some thoughts, some notes and questions of their own, which I'm going to try and weave into our conversation as we go. So I hope we're going to be able to have them represented in this conversation, even if they're not able to be here with us. Our subject is imposter syndrome, the feeling of doubting one's own skills, talent, competence in spite of what might be quite considerable concrete experience or external validation or accomplishment. We're going to talk about some of the possible causes, which might be individual and personal. They might be contextual, they might be structural. There may be some combination of these things. And we'll talk a bit about what it takes to feel like we deserve to call ourselves literary translators, what success might feel like in those terms. Just before I introduce Lisa and Vineet, I'm just going to give you a couple of housekeeping bits and pieces. The first is to say that closed captioning is available. If you want to use it, there is a button, I think it's the CC show captions button at the bottom of your screen. And we will, of course, be taking questions in the latter part of the event. Use the Q&A function. There is a chat as well, and you can chat to each other throughout, but use the Q&A function if you have a question on the subject for our speakers. If you'd like to ask a question anytime throughout the event, we might take it a little bit earlier, but otherwise we'll leave plenty of time to do that in the latter part of the event. Just a couple of introductions to our brilliant speakers. Thank you both for joining us. It's lovely to have you with us for this conversation. Lisa Hofmann-Kuroda, who is in New York at this point, is that right? Lisa is in New York. I'd quite like to be in New York, never mind. Lisa is a Japanese to English literary translator, born in Tokyo, raised in Texas, based now in New York City. She holds degrees from Wesleyan and from UC Berkeley. She's a two-time graduate of BCLT, British Centre for Literary Translation, and Lisa has work forthcoming from New Directions, from Knopf, from Strangers Press, and from Farrar, Straus and Girroux, FSG. She's joined by Vineet Lal, who is in Edinburgh, I'm guessing at this moment. Vineet is in Edinburgh, another place I'd quite like to be. Vineet studied French at Edinburgh and at Princeton, and translation and conference interpreting at Heriot-Watt. He's translated a number of well-known French writers, including Guillaume Musso, Michel, Bussi, and Grégoire Delacourt, as well as a number of books for younger readers. Vineet is currently co-chair of the Translators Association here in the UK and a trustee of the Edinburgh UNESCO City of Literature. Vineet also has a prior career before his time as a literary translator, where he held senior roles in tourism and destination marketing in Britain, England, Scotland, and Britain generally. So it's great to have you both with us. I'm going to start, I think, Vineet, with the, I suppose, the more personal aspect of this. You've talked in other interviews, I know, about your own experiences starting out in translation a little over a decade ago, I suppose, and a sense of not fitting in or being out of your depth or something. And I wonder if we can start with that. I wonder if you can say something about your early experiences in the translation world, the literary world, and your sense of your place in it at that time.
Thanks, Danny. That's a great place to kind of kick off. I suppose I would answer that by talking a bit about the fact that when I came to literary translation about 10 years ago, I'd probably never conceived of translation in a professional sense, literary translation in a professional sense, because all of my exposure to it had been through language learning and its use as a language acquisition tool. So that in itself was new, the potential to use one's skills in two languages and combine that with the active translation. That was already a bit of a different way of framing things. And then I think certainly in the beginning, what I found was that because it's a world where things are not clearly defined, certainly in terms of career progression or entry points, it was really daunting because I I didn't know all the right people. I didn't know all the right names. I hadn't probably read all the right books. I wasn't able to kind of formulate conversations where people would recognize me as somebody who was one of their peers, somebody who, you know, they could engage with. And I think for me, that was the difficulty, was this sense of slight alienation from a world I wanted to be part of, and a world that I felt that I had the credentials and the experience to forge a path in, but feeling there was this kind of this glass partition in front of me, and I could see through it as to where I wanted to be. But I just didn't have the tools, you know, whether that be connections or industry knowledge or experience of kind of finding my way through. And that was really hard. It's you know, it's this, I think it's inside sometimes you think, well, of course I belong here because I really want to do this. And look, I've done this and I've done this and I've done this and I've done really well in this part of my life. And yet that sense of not being able to break through, I think was, it lingered for quite a long time.
When you look back now, 10 years on, having published a lot and done very well, and, you know, coaching the TA and that kind of thing now, do you think now that you didn't have the resources in terms of knowing things, having read things, knowing your way around, and how much do you think you thought that? I suppose I've formulated that question quite right, but I wonder how much of it is actually not knowing things, and how much of it is thinking you don't because you don't know what it is you need to know because it's so opaque somehow. Yeah,
I think that's a really good point. I think it's a bit of both, to be honest. I think obviously when you're starting out in a new arena, there are things that you don't know, and there are some basics that you simply have to know. But I also think that the, if you like, the ecosystem or the ecosphere that surrounds literary translation can sometimes feel a little bit rarefied and a little bit, I wouldn't say elite, but it feels like it's a world that isn't for everyday folk, and therefore I think there was definitely a sense of gosh, this is really hard to break into this. What do I need to do? Who do I need to speak to? Who do I need to forge a relationship with in order to make it through? In fact, I remember one of the very first things I did, because I was naive enough, and I'd never do this now, was to go online and look up who were the, you know, well-known literary translators. And I remember coming across Frank Wynne in just like day 3 of this crazy notion that I could do this. And gosh, I would never do this now. I actually phoned him up, I think, or emailed him or something. And he very graciously, because he's a lovely kind of person, he called me back and was on the phone for an hour or so. But that, I think, demonstrates that, you know, I just didn't know my way around, and I just didn't know what the entry points were. So I think, to come back to your question, I think some of it is in the mind. It's to do with perception of who you are and your place within this rarefied ecosystem, and some of it is genuinely the fact that you need a certain amount of exposure to the industry to actually understand what the things are that you don't know, if you like, the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. You know, does that help? I'm not sure.
It does really help. I'm going to come to Lisa in a moment and ask, I suppose, a big picture question. But I wonder, there's just one other thing I'm going to pick up, Vineet, on that, which is, so Jamie, who's unable to be here with us, some of you I hope will have heard a conversation she had, must be about a year ago, with Rosie Eyre on the Writing Life podcast. It was a really interesting conversation, and one of the things that Jamie talks, which is I think still out there if you haven't had a chance to listen to it, and one of the things Jamie talks about is being, it was kind of going to publishing events and feeling inadequate and feeling out of her depth and not knowing people, and some of the many things that you described as well, Vineet. And it occurs to me that you and Jamie are on kind of similar trajectories in terms of timing, and there was almost certainly times when you were both in the same room. And I wonder whether you would have assumed that everyone else knows what they're doing, because you're also in a room with Jamie and all those other people who simultaneously wonder who this Vineet Lal is, who seems to know what he's doing. I wonder if one of the aspects of it is I am the only person who doesn't know, and everyone else has this secret code or this secret knowledge or this access somehow, and I'm the only one who doesn't.
I think that's very true, and I think that by nature I've changed, but by nature I think initially I wasn't very clever at saying that, or I didn't have the courage to say that out loud, and therefore just was panicking inside, thinking, "Gosh, I've been plunged into this particular world, and if it looks like I don't know what I'm doing, I'll be thrown out at the next, at the next junction, if you like. They won't hesitate in jettisoning me off the train." So I think there was a certain element of faking it, I guess, to think that you knew what you were doing, whereas internally I had no idea what I was doing. But to go back to your earlier question, there was probably stuff that I knew exactly what to do or what to say. I just wasn't brave enough, or I didn't feel it was appropriate to be part of the conversation because something higher, a greater level was expected of me. I think I felt the expectation was really high. And people's impressions of me were then going to be based on, what I said. And if I didn't feel I had something coherent and clever to say, then I wasn't going to be accepted into the fold.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Lisa, I want to kind of pull back a little bit and ask about the way these kind of personal experiences might be informed by structural things and kind of contextual things. One of the things that Jamie talked about, particularly in the podcast, was to do with class, but it can be race, it can be age. There are a number of different ways in which people's perception of you may inform the way you feel about yourself, but also may inform your sense of the opportunities you have. I'm just going to very quickly read something that Nadia wrote, Lisa, and ask you to respond to this. Nadia says, in some cases, rather than doubting our own abilities and qualifications, we may actually be doubting how we will be perceived by others. I wonder if you can say something about that interplay between the kind of structural things and the individual.
Yeah, thank you. So in preparation for this event, I was kind of looking into the origins of the term imposter syndrome because I was curious about it. And it seems like it was a term first coined in the 80s sometime, but there was a study done specifically of women women who were highly educated. And so in their professions or in, I assume a lot of them were in academia, there was this phenomenon found where a lot of them, despite, as you said, external evidence seemingly confirming that they had achieved a certain measure of success, an overwhelming number of them believed themselves to be frauds. And I think this idea of like fraudulence is really interesting, that it's not just about not being successful, but also about like faking people out somehow, that you're not like real to yourself. So it was intriguing to me that it was a very specific demographic that the term originated from, which was like highly educated women in the 80s. So, to me, it's interesting because it seems to be like a sociological phenomenon, like more than a psychological one, that I guess if you're thinking about the 70s and 80s and women in higher education, it was probably a time when there weren't that many women in higher education. Or, who had attained, PhDs and things like that. So perhaps it's just that you didn't see other people like you, right, in your spaces. And so you might start to feel like you didn't belong there. I mean, that seems like a pretty natural thing that one might feel. And it occurs to me that literary translation has a lot of highly educated women, though not all, obviously, but it tends to be a pretty highly like feminized profession. There's a lot of overlap between academia and translation, where a lot of people have masters and PhDs and things like that. So all of that, I think sort of feeds into this. And I was just like very interested in the origin of that. But go ahead.
Well, just going to say, just to pick up on what you were talking about, this kind of sociological thing more than perhaps a psychological one. But it seems to me like that it becomes an interesting psychological issue because we're talking about things that get internalized, right? It's not just we don't have these opportunities because there are biases, but it's also that these things actually get internalized to believe that maybe we don't deserve them, or people may be right, or I can't believe I'm fooling these people all this time.
Yeah. I think that's right. And I think, it probably applies to any sort of group that is underrepresented in a particular area. If you are the only one of like your group, right, in a particular area, you may feel even more self-conscious. You may feel, again, like you don't belong there, that you have to work harder to prove yourself, that the goalposts are always moving for you but not for others. Anyway, so yeah, I guess like it's weird because thinking about all of that, it makes sense. But in my case, like I guess I should also say that I am still an emerging translator. I'm in the emerging translator valley of death, as Anton Hur calls it. I don't know when I stopped being emerging, but I really only started doing translation a couple of years ago, actually during the pandemic. Yeah, I actually didn't feel like it was such a rarefied thing, or like I didn't really have the experience of it being such an exclusive community where I felt like I didn't belong. I'm a Twitter millennial, so I came across other translators online first. And because 2020 was a time when everything was online, it actually felt surprisingly easy to kind of talk and meet with people because so much was happening online and it was quite accessible in that way. And I was also like super lucky really early on to come across a group of translators who called themselves the BIPOC Translators Literary Caucus. It was started, I think, at an Alta conference a few years ago, but basically just an informal network of translators of color who, just came together to basically like share resources and advice and things like that. And so joining that group, like really early on was so helpful. And, it gave me a space to just ask questions. There were people in there that were experienced and also people that had no idea, that they were just starting out. So it was like a really welcoming space where, it was very not judgmental and people could ask questions, ask for a contact if they needed it. And so I felt super, super lucky to have that kind of thing early on.
And so there's something like the BIPOC caucus, which there were some great readings in Tucson last year, which I was at, which was great.
Yeah.
It's what you're getting then. I want to talk later in our conversation about what are the things that are helpful, but what you're describing is a kind of context where you are made welcome, essentially. Is that a reasonable summary of it?
I think so. There, I feel like I've arrived very late to the game, and there have been people doing this much longer than me, but there did seem to be a recognition at the point that I entered things around 2019, 2020, there just seemed to already be a recognition that this was a problem, that the lack of representation of, translators of color was a problem, that the profession was dominantly white, older, middle class, like things like this, and that there's a variety of reasons for that, many of them, economic, but there was at least that recognition. And so in attempt to kind of address it in a small way, there was a intentional creation of this space, to try to encourage people. And so I think that helps a lot, actually, to have those kinds of spaces where you don't have to kind of spiral inward into self-doubt because this fact, about your underrepresentation has already been acknowledged openly, and people are working kind of together to solve it.
Well, one of the things I wanted to talk to you both about is what you're describing is a recognition that there are kind of hierarchies that may need to be kind of upended somehow. That metaphor doesn't really work, but you know what I mean. I don't know if you can upend a hierarchy, but anyway. But I wanted to talk about the sort of hierarchies of language, of background, of the kind of things that are built into how we value things in this profession, in this sector. And again, I'm just going to start with something that Nadia wrote. Nadia wrote an article called Vanilla Sorbet, which I think is on the NCW website. It's really brilliant. And one of the things that kind of prompted this conversation. And she talks about the specific reasons for imposter syndrome manifesting in relation to heritage languages, multilingual settings with language hierarchy, and stigmatized, under-recognized languages, as well as, in her case, growing up outside of Mauritius. She also says, I also learned that others in Mauritius had similar thoughts and experiences, and eventually to accept it as part of a distinctly Mauritian experience. But she doesn't know whether other people who work with heritage languages particularly recognize something similar. And Lisa, this is also, I suppose, for you as someone who translates from Japanese. How does that play into, I suppose, how you feel about the kind of opportunities that are available and the kind of position that you are allowed to have or welcomed into in this sector that we work in?
Yeah, that's a good question, and something I've thought a lot about. It may be different for other languages, but for Japanese, because of the history and of the translation process, it seems to be that translators of Japanese are overwhelmingly white American or European, sort of take an early interest in the Japanese culture or something like that, go to Japan, have some sort of study abroad experience, come back and start translating. And that was true in academia too. That narrative seemed to be the common one. And I think more so when I was in academia than I did feel in translation. I felt very alienated by that. And I felt like my motivation for translating Japanese was really different from other people's, and it wasn't out of this kind of fascination with the culture or anything like that. In fact, I think my relationship with Japan has always been extremely ambivalent and kind of a love-hate relationship, and so that it sometimes felt like there wasn't space for that ambiguity and even some of the negative feelings I might have toward the language. Or I've had a lot of negative experiences with the language and with the culture, so in a setting where people are, expressing positive feelings and saying I'm so passionate about the language and the culture, and I'm so passionate about the literature and the translation. There can feel sometimes, I think, for heritage speakers who may have more complex histories to the language, is there space to also express ambiguity? Maybe negative feelings, is there space for that too? And in terms of feeling like an imposter, I don't know, I've thought a lot about the history of heritage language speakers and translators within the larger history of translation. I think this has been written about, but this phenomenon of bridge translations, for example, used to be very common, where basically a text would have two translators, one, a native or heritage speaker of the source language, and two, a translator who did not really know the source language well or very well, but was tasked with basically editing what the heritage or native translator had done, basically. And that was called a bridge translation. Inherent in that kind of split is this idea that if you are a native speaker or a heritage speaker, if you have this very close relationship with the language, that you somehow your role in the translation is one of kind of a mechanical worker rather than an artist, right? And that your job is to just get the meaning down on the page, get it accurate. And then the other person, usually the white translator, right, can come in and make it beautiful. And that's where the art comes in. But that those two skills sort of can't exist in the same person, or that if you're too close to the language, there's a problem, or you can't be trusted to sort of make it sound beautiful because you're too close to the language. I don't know. All of that, I've thought about those things, and I don't know, this idea of being too close to a language, I think about it a lot, and whether that comes up in my own feelings about my work. I think sometimes it does, but I try to just let it pass, I guess. But I've definitely thought about it a lot.
There's something that Nadia says about writing about Mauritian Creole. She says, I knowing how imperfectly I speak it makes me feel like an imperfect Mauritian, an imposter. And this is only reinforced by my limited experience of living in Mauritius. And this is talking about heritage language, but a sense of inadequacy in relation to that. Vineet, as someone who's translating, not working with a heritage language, but a language which is acquired through study, I wonder whether there are aspects of your kind of competence in the language you do translate that, or anxieties about that feed into this sort of imposter question, the extent to which, your French is brilliant. Is your French ever going to be brilliant enough? Is it ever going to be quite adequate to what is being asked of it?
That's such a raw nerve you've touched there, Danny, in terms of, things I think about all the time. Perhaps I could answer that by linking back to what Lisa and you were just discussing in terms of heritage languages. So because of my own ethnicity, I've grown up certainly at home speaking, I guess I don't know what the word is, let's call them heritage languages. So in my case, languages from South Asia. And I guess I feel, putting French to one side, I feel even more of an imposter when it comes to those heritage languages, because although I can use them perfectly well within, a domestic context and a family context and an everyday context, in order to, communicate in quite a sophisticated way, and even, speaking to, people in other countries and having, a dialogue which is by no means rudimentary. We're talking really kind of very fluent conversations. But because I've not had the academic support, I haven't studied those things formally. I perpetually feel like if I were to be brazen enough to say I was going to translate from one of those languages, let alone the external world, I would just feel I just didn't have the credentials to do it. I can't envisage myself ever doing it unless I were somehow to, summon up the courage to actually do some kind of academic, training in those languages. It's just not in me, and I suppose that's a combination of both internal feeling of inadequacy, coupled with clearly a perception of inadequacy from the external world, because I don't know those languages. This is the irony. I've grown up speaking them at home, and yet I feel like I know them even less than a modern European language, which I'd never spoken a word of until I was 12 or 13. So this is secondary school when I first started French. So that already is a weird kind of setup where something that you've heard since birth, you deem to be less capable of manipulating artistically than, if you like, an imported language, that you've had to acquire through study at school. So that's the first thing. Coming to French. Go on.
French, can I just pick you up on one word you used? I was interested when you were talking about feeling like you don't have the credentials, was the word you used to talk about not feeling like you could translate from a South Asian language. And I just wanted to pause on that word before we move on to French, because I think that's a really interesting word in terms of what it reveals about who is authorizing these things and how this is measured, and who gets to decide that you get a certificate saying you are now a plausible, trustworthy, whatever word you want to choose, translator from this language. That's an interesting word.
It is. I think there's an objective element to that, which is clearly, if you're going to be a good translator from any language, you've got to know your source language, and I'm already way down the scale on that, because the languages I've grown up speaking bilingually or trilingually, I know as spoken languages and not as written languages. So irrespective of any kind of subjective perception, there is a knowledge gap there. I do not write and read those languages the way that I read and write French. So I couldn't possibly translate unless that knowledge gap was removed. I think what you're talking about, though, is the next level up. Say I did, read and write from those languages well, then, what would make me a plausible translator from those languages? And I suppose there I would also feel inadequate, because without having had some kind of academic rigor, this is very personal, without having academic rigor behind me, I sometimes feel that I just don't have the authority to put pen to paper or finger to keyboard to say, this sentence, this paragraph, this page means this, and it could be that that's very personal, or it could be that, I don't know, it's also how the world would view you. What I find, if I can move on to French, what I find with French is kind of fundamental to my ability, is both a combination of knowing that I've got the academic credentials in my back pocket should anyone ever question me. That's the external view. But more importantly, the internal knowledge, which is really strong, and the confidence that absolutely give me a text, and I might not know all the words, but I can pretty much have as good a stab at it as any other translator, within my kind of within my peer group. So I think that's what makes the difference. And yet, yes, there's this weird kind of paradox, isn't there, that an acquired language, not one that I could have developed for free, is one that I feel more, I feel less of an imposter in than I would with a heritage language. But that doesn't mean to say I don't feel like an imposter in French. I guess you were talking about the fact, how perfect is it? And I often think about this, well, it's never going to be perfect because I don't know it the way that I know English. And I don't know what the alchemy is that makes a language perfect in your head. So if I take English, there's very little of the English language that I don't know or can't recognize. It doesn't mean to say I know everything in the dictionary, far from it. But there's very little in the Anglophone world that I can't comprehend or understand, register or meaning. French is a different ballgame. I suppose I know an awful lot of it, and I'm often surprised by how well I comprehend of it. Given that languages are kind of infinite, I'm always surprised by what kind of that common set of knowledge you need to have to master a language well. So I feel very comfortable, but I always worry that there are nuances that I'm never going to get because I haven't had that same alchemy that made English my first language. I've not had the same experience with French. But maybe that's the conundrum that all translators face, because there's always going to be, the scales are always going to be slightly weighted in one direction or the other. And that's just how it is. You take advantage of the fact that you have, near perfection in your mother tongue, and you do the very best job that you can with a language where you don't have that same near, but you have the detective skills and the desire to root out meaning and artistry, as Lisa called it, in order to make that as close to perfection as you can.
It's really interesting. I'd like to move on slightly from what you're just saying. Vineet, you said something about something inherent in all translators' experience, and I think what you described will be recognizable to some people, though it depends on your relationships to your languages. But I wanted to ask a kind of more general thing, and Lisa, I'll turn to you about this. Jamie's written something about the extent to which imposter syndrome might be part of the human condition, something that applies to professional creative pursuits anyway. It's a thing that is made more difficult, made more problematic, and can be felt more aggressively if there are structural issues in place. But also it is possible to feel inadequate even if one has a lot of privilege and a lot of prestige. It is possible to not value one's own work. But I want to move through that to this question of whether there are things about being a translator particularly that are somehow conducive to this. Nadia suggested that there's something about the kind of perfectionism. I think there's something to do with the kind of instability of the profession as well, the lack of autonomy of the profession. And I wonder, Lisa, whether you think there are things that are that might be sort of common to everyone or most people who are in this profession, just because circumstantially there are things about it that are more conducive to not quite knowing how to value ourselves, not quite knowing how to value our own work, not having the autonomy to control our careers sort of directly.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in thinking about this term from, like a labor perspective and a work perspective, as you're saying, like, who benefits from us feeling like imposters or like what happens when we feel like imposters is like we work a lot more, right? Or we work and work and work and work, right? For very little money. And I think there's like,
and we're grateful. Sorry to interrupt you, but I think there's a kind of gratitude that comes from that when work or opportunities or anything, that I can't believe that of course I don't have to be paid. I'm just so lucky that someone thinks I'm worth listening to or hearing from or whatever it is.
Yes, exactly. I mean, if you feel like a fraud, you're going to take any opportunity that comes your way for, a low amount of pay, right? And I guess, this is probably something that we share with other creative professions, but this kind of contradiction of like literary translation being seen as very elite and very like, I don't know, something that only very educated people have access to or can do, coupled with the fact that we're paid like nothing for what we do. So that seems like a contradiction. And I guess it's also something we share with some academics as well. So I think, it's like difficult to discount the role of like economics, if we're talking about value. If you're being paid very little for your work, maybe you feel like you don't have a lot of value, or that you have to work harder to prove your value. Or if you only worked, this much more, maybe things would improve or you'd feel better about yourself. So like, and of course we can have external validation in other forms, like, reviews and comments from our peers and things like that. But at a fundamental level, like if we're not paid, like fairly, right, for our work, then I think that's going to affect how we feel about it, at least in my opinion.
But even those kinds of external validation that we can have, there's also something, I don't know, this could be for either of you, I suppose, but there's something very exposing about the how erratic that feedback is, and knowing that, you might spend 3 months on this thing in essentially total silence, at which point you will discover, do they love it, do they hate it, will they pay me, will they get good reviews or bad reviews or whatever. But even if that validation comes in, there's a really long period of you sitting with doubt or hope or something, thinking, I hope I'm not screwing up and I haven't realized quite what a disaster this is. Both of you, that's reassuring.
Well, I'm petrified all the time working on a translation for many reasons. So there's what I said earlier about are my antennae, are they working strongly enough? Am I seeing everything in this text? Am I seeing wordplay? Am I seeing puns? Am I seeing culturally specific references? Is that a line from a song? And with the best will in the world, I'm never going to catch everything. So all I can hope is that I catch most of the stuff. I've lost count of the times when I've seen something perfectly innocent, and by sheer chance, I've thrown it into Google or something, and it comes up with all of these kind of other references, and your heart sinks because you think, gosh, have I missed something else somewhere along the way? I exaggerate slightly for effect. I'm not as rubbish as I sound, but it's something that I'm always aware of is how sensitive can I possibly be to catch everything that's going on in this particular text. And then when you're actually producing your target text, it's, as you're saying, Danny, it's developing, it's overcoming your own inherent sense that, well, this is complete rubbish. This doesn't even sound good, and it's getting over that hurt. I've become better at it, and I've got to the point where I can read, a week's work that I've done and see, actually, this isn't too bad. This is okay. This actually makes sense, and it sounds like it's, as if it were written by an English speaker. But it's taken me a long time to get to that stage. It's taken me a long time to, let go of the side and to be less, mentally attached to the source text and follow it really closely. But these are required skills, and like I say, the sense of being a fraud all the time just persists for the reasons I've just mentioned about, because I'm not a native French speaker. So, is everything going to resonate in my head the way it would have resonated Of course it's not, because I'm not that person. I'm a different person. And also, when I get edits back, for example, one of the things I always panic about is, not panic, but, I feel deflated about is when they're really good edits. And it's great when you get really good edits, but then you kind of chastise yourself and think, well, why didn't you think of that in the first place? Why did it need somebody else externally to point that out? But that's just how it is. I've just got to learn that's how these things work. You need a third party to bring something extra, because, what would the point be? There needs to be that kind of juxtaposition of you, the translator, and the editor. But that still makes me feel like an imposter when, there's a much better way of formulating a particular sentence, and I'm not the one that came up with it, but the editor did. Do you see what I'm getting at? That also makes me feel slightly, not quite the finely tuned machine that I guess I imagine I should be in my head.
I wonder then, Lisa, that the thing that you were talking about before about things like the BIPOC caucus and having a kind of a peer group, a support group, a community, whether those things help with that, the sort of validation. I don't just mean about belonging, but I mean about being good at this. In those kind of periods between, this book and the next book and one edit and the next, or the reviews or whatever, in those periods when you're working on things, whether one of the ways of being reassured that you're actually really good at this comes from those kinds of groups of support.
Yeah, I guess what I get from those groups isn't so much like validation that I'm good at something, but that I'm just part of a community of other people that are doing it. And yeah, like a reminder. I mean, the things that we talk about, like technical issues with texts that we're struggling with, but we also a lot of times talk about industry issues, like how to negotiate a contract, right? How to I don't know, how to respond to an editor, there's any number of things that people seek advice for. And like, I don't know, I guess the sense that we're like collectively like problem solving these things, and that like, it's when we share our experiences with others that, things can get better for all of us, hopefully, right? Rather than being kind of siloed in these individual ways. And likewise with a text, if you're working on it and you show it to people, you get different reads on it, like it's only going to improve. And so like, yeah, I guess like thinking of translation more as like a communal and a collective thing rather than like so individual, because when you're just by yourself, right, it's easier to spiral into self-doubt. But yeah, when you're able to talk through things with other people, get advice, ask questions, right? I think, I don't know if it, makes the feelings go away completely, but it definitely like, I don't know, focuses your attention in a different direction maybe, or
It's interesting. I'm going to read just very quickly one other thing that Nadia wrote, which is about she was answering the question about what made a difference to her, to feeling comfortable and getting over feelings of kind of inadequacy or imposter syndrome. And she talks about having a literature translation mentor, working with a co-translator, reaching out to other translators to ask questions, networking, attending courses, supportive residency atmosphere at the National Centre for Writing. These are the big things that come to mind. They're all about engaging with other people and engaging with peers. Co-translation, particularly, she says, helped me to show that other translators second guess as much as I do. We can discuss different options, mutually decide. I learned a lot from seeing other translators' approaches and so forth. And it feels like there is something about, and I hope this event is a kind of example of that, of people being able to be quite candid about the challenges they face, in a way that does help to know that other people are trying to find ways around comparable things, and that I'm not the only person in the room who thinks that everyone else has got it figured out. And
I really appreciate when translators talk about their process, like in any way, right? Just whether it's about first drafts, whether they're any part of their process, their editing process, like to make it just all less mysterious, right? That it's not just like you have a text and then you spit into a machine and out comes a perfect translation, right? There's all kinds of like messy stages. And it's always really nice when you can see other people working through that too.
I'm going to ask a couple more things of both of you, and then take some of the questions from the audience. Don't forget, if you're watching, you can put questions in the Q&A. We'll come to those very shortly. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was, we talked a little bit about some of the kind of hierarchies involved in languages and identities of translators as well come up. But I want to talk a bit about the kind of translation that are valued, or the kind of texts maybe that are valued differently. I think it's interesting, Lisa, first of all, when I read your bio and said, New Directions and Knopf and FSG, there's a prestige, right? There's a kind of cultural capital in translating a certain kind of text. And I wonder how the two of you feel about, again, this is something that Jamie wrote to us about feeling that certain kind of work, certain kind of book are valued more or less, not by the market, in fact, it's almost often the other way around, by the market, but by peers, or by somehow the community, which we talk about translation. I mean, Vineet, I know that you have committed the cardinal sin of translating several writers who people actually want to read, which is a terrible and shameful thing to have done. I wonder whether that feels like, whether you're kind of conscious of therefore being in somehow a different sort of position.
Totally, and I think you're spot on, Danny. So yes, I'm in a situation where everything I've done to date has been stuff that's been commercially very successful, phenomenally successful. So that's the kind of work I've translated. And yes, that does perpetuate, that does fuel the imposter element of it, because there's almost this kind of, they're almost diametrically opposed. The stuff that seems to be commercially successful isn't the kind of stuff that ends up being on prize nomination lists, or being feted in critical reviews and all of this kind of stuff. So you do end up thinking, actually, I'm doing all of this work, and yet it's never going to be appreciated through the same lens as an international Booker nominated book or whatever. I think I've become much better at dealing with that, really, certainly over the last couple of years, and I've kind of made peace with myself in as much as I know that the graft involved, the skill involved, is no different between a genre fiction title and this kind of stuff that Jamie's talking about, and the stuff that does find itself on critically reviewed lists and the best books or whatever. So I think I've kind of got over that. But nevertheless, there remains a perception issue that translators who only do, or who predominantly work on genre fiction, are somehow not as skilled, or of a lesser caliber, if you like, than the prestige titles. But the truth is that the true skill of a translator is to be able to do both, as we all know. And people like Frank and yourself, you turn your hand to whatever is out there. I suppose in many ways what I've just said also illustrates the challenges that face someone breaking into the profession, because I think, Lisa, you said this earlier, about if you feel like a fraud, then you'll take whatever you're given. And that's true. When you start out, you take whatever comes your way, because you think, gosh, if I don't do this, then I'll have nothing to show that I'm even half good at it. You have to kind of, accept what work comes your way, and you can't be too selective about it.
Well,
should I jump in?
Yeah, jumping ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. So I feel like I've had like a slightly different experience from most people, but like I didn't really have projects coming my way. Like I had one that did come my way, that I was really lucky to get, and it was a co-translation, and yeah, it was wonderful. But everything else, like I've pitched and pitched and pitched my way into this industry. And I got lucky. I know that pitching is often met with deafening silence of editors, but yeah, so like it's true that what you said about, prestige publishers and things like that, but like I've only pitched things that like I felt were things that I was genuinely like interested in, or like were telling stories that I didn't really see being told in the kind of literature that's being translated from Japanese. And I guess I didn't pay too much mind to whether it was like a work of high literary fiction or genre fiction. And in fact, I'm actually like working on 2 books simultaneously right now, which are totally different. And one is like very much genre fiction, and the other one is like really high, like experimental, weird literary stuff. And so like toggling between those 2 has been like really interesting. But yeah, I try not to like pay too much mind to that distinction, because I think like in the end, like they're like amazing like works of genre fiction that are asking like really important political questions, and I want to work on those books. And conversely, like there's high literary fiction that's like really boring and I don't like necessarily want to work on them. And a lot of times those are the things that get prizes in Japan, which is like really weird. But yeah, so I try to kind of like I try to look at the work for what it is, I think, and to sort of see what kinds of like questions the work is asking, and like what my investment in the book is, like what my relationship to those questions are. Like that's really what draws me to a book, I think, not so much like, I mean, like, yeah, I guess in the end of the day, like I'm like happy to work on genre fiction if I think it's like doing something interesting.
Thank you. That's very good to hear. I'm just going to race through as many of these questions as we can. And actually, Kathy has a question which relates to what I was going to ask you last, which is about how you each define success, whether that's changed, whether you are aiming for something in particular, whether it's calibrated according to what other people are doing, whether it's to do with being a full-time translator, or being able to choose, or being able to make money, or whatever. Kathy phrases it like this. She asks if there's any advice for emerging translators who are in danger of leaving the profession because of these feelings of being an imposter, and what are the signs, she asks, that you are an imposter, or that is to say not suited to the profession. How do you know you're successful? So briefly, how do each of you define that, or is it a moving target? Lisa, what about you? Is it something that do you know the answer to that question? I'm not sure one has to know, but I'm interested to know whether you do know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious about this question. Like, what are the signs that you're actually an imposter? I mean, like, I guess if you like really like can't read the language at all, like you probably shouldn't be a translator. But yeah, I think like there's just this perpetual learning curve, right? Like with every text, like there's new kinds of vocabulary that's coming up, and like every text is going to throw new challenges your way. So like, yeah, I don't think that I don't think that there are actual imposters. I mean, if you're interested in it and you're, committed to doing it, like I think, yeah, I don't think you're an imposter. But it is true that it's like can be a really punishing profession, and like opportunities are not meted out equally. And yeah, even if you like have all the qualifications and skills, like it's still possible that like projects won't come your way. And that's just like really unfair. And yeah, I don't know exactly what to say to that, except like for me, like the number one thing I try to tell people, I guess, is that for me, like starting out, the thing that I spent the most time doing is reaching out to other translators who worked in my language pair. And I really spent a lot of time trying to get to know the other translators in my group, or in that work with Japanese and English, because there aren't that many. And when I developed relationships with those people is when things began to develop. Rather than say banging my head against a wall, pitching editor. I mean, I did pitch, but like all those opportunities to pitch came through my friendships and relationships with other translators. And it was really other translators that like helped me get things, not editors, not, going to like these networking events. It was like reaching out to people individually and like getting to know them, and having them have a chance to know me and my skills and what I was interested in, that like really led to things. So like, I would say that that's like super important, and maybe gets missed a lot of times in these kind of like how to become a translator, like get to know other translators, because I learned to be a translator from hanging out with other translators. And so, I think that's like super key.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to something you said in a moment. But Vineet, what about you? How do you know what you're aiming at?
I think I have a better idea than I did before. I think Lisa's absolutely right. I don't think there are any imposters. I think what we're debating here is your own internalized fear that you are an imposter, rather than any truth about the fact that people are just kind of faking it in the profession. Because, Lisa's absolutely right. You wouldn't even, big set out if you couldn't master the source language and have some level of skill that would enable you to make that kind of both the language transfer and the artistry side of it. So I think I don't think anyone is an imposter, but I think what's more important is our sense that somehow we are kidding ourselves on or kidding the rest of the world on. I did a book, I think it was the year before last, maybe it was last year, start of last year, and I remember delivering that manuscript and thinking to myself, actually, that was a good job. And I think I wouldn't have thought that maybe at the start, but and there's so many things that magically came together to that feeling. There was the voice of my mentor, because I started out being mentored a decade ago, and there was the voice of my mentor in my head, and I felt quite pleased, almost slightly smug with myself that were she in this case to look over what I just submitted. There'd be very few reasons for her to raise an eyebrow, because I could defend just about every choice I've made. So that for me was a marker of success, that on the day of delivery, I felt that, this is a damn good translation, right? It needs work, but it's pretty damn good. And then the second level of that was when a year later I had the opportunity to look at it again for the paperback edition with fresh eyes. And I remember this sense of, again, let's call it smugness. We're between friends here. Let's say it's kind of a smugness that as I went through it, I could see things that, were tiny, infinitesimal, or really, really quite subtle. But I made those changes, and I felt that for me was a marker of success, that I could now look at my own work and I could see things that they weren't wrong. It's just that there was a better or a more elegant way of dealing with it. Things that sounded a little bit, awkward. I could iron out and I could smooth out. And to me, if you like, that was in many ways the best place to be. That not only was I happy with what I did the first time round, but I had the critical ability to look at my own work with a questioning eye and to make changes, which I know I don't need a third party to tell me that they are improvements, because they make the text better. And like I say, 10 years ago, I would never have had the courage to say that I was able to look at a text and make it better. But I can, because I've got that skill now. Gosh, I've surprised myself by saying that. Do you see what I mean? That to me is a marker of it kind of all came together, the initial mentorship period, and then, the sense of self-doubt doing samples and not being quite sure about something. It does get better with time, but, it can only get better if you have the self-confidence to say, do you know what, just red pen that, because that's just rubbish, and just find a completely different way of saying it. And that's hard won, that ability to let go of the side. I love that metaphor.
I wanted to race through a few of these things. What you said, Vineet, relates to a comment from Lucy, which I think was talking about when you were talking earlier about the slightly demoralizing thing of getting an edit back and going, why didn't I think of that? And Lucy talks about, in a comment about how it's often the editor who has the distance to see an even better solution. But there's another question from Ilse Duarte, which relates, which I'm going to ask you, Lisa, which is about editing, but editing not necessarily from professional editors, but it might be from peers, from co-translators. Ilse asks whether you work with editors who've helped you fill in gaps or make better choices at certain points in your translation without making you feel you were making you feel like a collaborator rather than a labourer whose work needs perfected. What you were talking about, the kind of native informant, the British translators, whether at least there are people you have worked with in a way that is actually collaboratively. I mean, you mentioned having done a co-translation to start, right?
Yeah. I haven't had so much experience yet, but of the few I've had, I can talk about. I had a really great co-translation experience with Alison, Mark, and Powell. It was actually the first book I've worked on, and I guess there's a lot of different ways to do co-translation, but we chose to like each take alternating chapters, translate alternating chapters. And after we'd done like 4 or so of them, we'd switch the chapters and edit each other. And so it ended up feeling like each chapter was kind of a blend of each of our voices, because we'd done a really thorough editing job with each of us, with each of our chapters. And yeah, that did feel like a collaborative, it did feel very different from being told like, this is wrong, change this, right? Because we would go through every decision together. And sometimes, you know, one of us would push back and say like, actually, no, I think I want to keep that. And we're able to kind of talk it out, right? Each decision live. And I think that was really cool. And it, yeah, different from other experiences I've had, but it felt like there was room to disagree. And there was some times where we would come up together with a different solution completely. So yeah, I would say it is possible.
Well, it relates. So there's a question, Lisa, from Ian Giles, who asks, to what extent well-known translators or celebrity translators within your language pair or any other, whether that they are a kind of help or a hindrance in terms of imposter syndrome, whether it's useful to be able to look up to people, aspire to be like people who have gained that kind of experience, or whether it's demoralizing because you see people who you perceive to be doing better and don't suffer from any of these anxieties. I wonder whether Vineet was talking about being mentored by Sarah, but I wonder whether also, Lisa, doing a co-translation with someone like Alison, who's brilliant and who's really experienced and like, you know, she's really good, whether that's a useful thing to have kind of when you're starting out, to have a sense of this being who I want to be when I grow up, not to quite like that, but you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, it didn't, in a way, like the co-translation was, you know, almost like a mentorship, but it didn't really feel like one at the same time because we were working on the book together, right? So it's not as though she was like advising me on what I should do on a particular work, but we were like, she made me feel like an equal partner in the project, which I really appreciated. And I think that maybe that's a little bit different from a mentorship situation, but yeah, what was I going to say? Oh, about the star translator thing. I don't know. I suppose sometimes I feel translator jealousy about, you know, translators getting certain projects that I wish I could have worked on, or awards or things like that. But I also know that I'm realistic and that I really like it's a drop in the bucket. I've only been doing this for a couple years, and I'm grateful to have gotten the projects, you know, I have gotten so far. And so yeah, I don't, it doesn't bother me too much, I guess, you know, I know most of them. And so, and many of them have been really helpful and kind to me and have helped me, you know, succeed and get projects. So I like to think, or I hope to think of other translators, especially in my language pair, as like coworkers rather than, you know, competitors per se, even though publishers treat us that way.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Vineet, maybe you can answer this one. We'll have to do it quite briefly, but then the question from Hazel, who asks about imposter syndrome in relation to the author of the original book, whether it's a very translation-specific imposter syndrome, that constant trying to live up to the original great work of art kind of thing. And I wonder, Vineet, whether you think that's one of the things that plays into it for a translator, particularly the sense that you're always trying not to be the inferior version or the secondary version or the less valued version or the unfaithful or whatever, pick an adjective version, whether that's part of the thing that's kind of built in, maybe unavoidably built into how translators feel about knowing that there's never a perfect piece of work you can do.
I actually think it helps, because I think that notion that there is, you know, that this piece of music has been played twice, that it was played once, you know, by the original author, and now you've been given the score and you've got a different instrument and you've got to play it again a second time. To me, that actually helps in the creative process, because I know it's never going to sound exactly the same, because, you know, it might be the same score, but, you know, there are different elements, different parameters at play. So for me, that's quite liberating. I think what I found sometimes actually, and is that there are things that you spot or that you notice that actually in many ways can tidy up the original, and that's not meant to sound arrogant, as if somehow, translators produce a better version of the text and they're different. But I feel immensely pleased when there are things that understandably just, didn't get caught, in the first iteration. And if somehow you can bring your added value to the second telling of this text and somehow make it even truer to what you think was the author's original intent, to me, that's one of the most gratifying parts of the process. And it's not just about, anachronisms or typos or things that were kind of wrong or factual detail. It's just, the odd judicious change here and there that, for example, I was working on a thriller recently, and I just felt that, it was brilliant. I mean, the twist was amazing, but I thought actually, if we just turn the volume down in this particular chapter, or, just don't quite use that expression there that might give the game away, it might just make for a better reading experience. I always think of what Adriana Hunter, really well-known translator, said to me right at the beginning, and that was that her aim was always to give the reader of her translation the same ride as the first reader had. And I always remember that. And I think for me, that's the key thing when I'm working the text. So yes, the original author is always there, but I feel as if I'm equally important, because I've taken that score and I'm playing it in a way that I think is only I can play. Nobody else is going to play it the same way.
Thank you. Just a couple more, just very quickly before we wrap up. And this one follows on from that question about. So, well, I'll read this one. April Overstreet says, Lisa, I'll ask you this one. I think in the context of the imposter effect, Lisa's point that literary translation is itself a creative activity is helpful because it frees us up to remember that the human element is absolutely essential in what we do. We aren't being measured against a mythical perfect translation. The collaborative aspect of translation as a profession, or collectively problem solving, as Lisa mentioned, is super significant. As an emerging literary translator with a significant background in academia, can you comment, please, on specific ways we can build and join community? Lisa, are there tips, are there shortcut places to go? What would you suggest?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I have, as I mentioned, the BIPOC Literary Caucus was a really foundational group for me, just as a place to meet colleagues and friends. A lot of translators have started collectives, which I think is amazing, either around a particular interest or a language group. To me, I feel like the most natural way to build community is with other translators in your language group, just because you share a lot of similar problems, things in common, right? You might know similar texts and authors, but maybe not. Maybe there's something else that you're, maybe there's some other affinity that you can find with other translators. But yeah, the more people you can get to know, I think only the better. I'm also really interested in, forming community with people around improving our working conditions. And maybe that's a slightly different approach, but thinking about sharing information around pay and rates and contract terms, that kind of thing is really important as a way of collectively supporting and defending ourselves in what can be a really predatory profession, actually, because when we're freelancers and when we're individual and isolated, first of all, we can be pitted against each other by publishers, over a project, for example, but also forced to undercut each other in terms of pay. So, if I know that a publisher reached out to two other translators I know about the same project and has offered me less, but I've talked to them and I know what they've been offered, we can then strategize together, right? So even at a professional sort of angle, I think, it's really, really important for your own self-protection to kind of talk openly about these things, even though because of bourgeois tendencies, we're all encouraged never to talk about money. But I think it's also really important to do that.
Bourgeois tendencies and anti-competition laws, which we don't talk about.
Right.
A separate thing, which we're not going to go into here. That's really interesting. answered, Lisa. Thank you. I'm sorry, we're not going to get to quite all of the questions here. We have several more, and they're all very interesting, but we are going to have to wrap up in just a moment. There's a comment from Lorna about responding to what you were saying, Lisa, earlier about being able to share processes. I think when we're talking about not just conditions and publishers and money, but being able to share processes can be a reassuring thing. There's an interesting comment from Cameron about feelings of inadequacy with heritage languages, particularly relating to something Vineet was talking about. We are going to have to wrap it up. I'm sorry to those of you who asked questions we didn't get to answer, but we have been talking slightly longer than we were going to. So thank you for bearing with us. Thank you to all of you who've been listening to this. I should just say, I am going to wrap this up in a second, but I'm going to very quickly give a plug to another event which is part of the same series. It is the Industry Week for the Emerging Translators Mentorship at the moment, which has a couple of public events, of which this is the first. And the other one is an event next Saturday, which is at 10 a.m. GMT, but it will be recorded and available to watch later for those of you for whom 10 a.m. GMT is not a sympathetic time of day. So for Lisa, for example, will not have to be up at 5 in the morning. It's on the life cycle of a translation, and it's for emerging translators, for emerging authors, and it'll be talking about rights and scouting and all the things that go into those kind of mechanisms. So do look on the NCW, National Centre for Writing website, and I see Rebecca's already posted something about that in the chat, so do look into that if you're able to and if you're interested. We are going to have to wrap it up. I'm sorry, there is a lot more to talk about, but I feel like we've, as is often the way, we've started a very interesting conversation and there are lots of questions. Thank you both, Lisa and Vineet, for being so thoughtful and for being candid and for being generous with your ideas and your thoughts. And thank you all very much for watching. You will have to give because we're not in a room, give a kind of virtual round of applause, clap, wave, something or other to Lisa Hofmann-Kuroda and Vineet Lal. Thank you all very much and good night.